This is Amy, and you're listening to the Talkin' Appalachian podcast.
I actually got my degree in oral history. I went to night school. I started out at Berkeley. Didn't quite work out. I had to drop out of school. I ended up hitchhiking across the country, ended up in the coal fields of West Virginia.
Jeff Biggers is an award-winning historian, journalist, novelist, and playwright. He's the author of 10 books, including The United States of Appalachia, which was published 20 years ago. His work has appeared on National Public Radio and Public Radio International, The New York Times, Washington Post, Guardian, Atlantic Monthly, Huffington Post, Salon, The Nation, and more. As a playwright and performer of monologues, he appears at theaters and festivals, conferences, and schools. He's worked as a writer, performer, and educator across the United States, Europe, India, and Mexico. He focuses on a historical storytelling approach he calls Re-Storification, which is the process of unearthing and forging new stories, rituals, and gatherings that recover the withered or denied strands of history and reshape its continuum between the past and the present. He joined me recently at the University of Virginia's College at Wise to talk about the United States of Appalachia 20 years later and how his goal was the re-storification of Appalachia by introducing innovators that had not necessarily made the pages of history books in association with their Appalachian heritage or Appalachian background. He recounts, for example, meeting Don West, who was one of the three that started what we now know as Appalachian literature, the Big Bang of Appalachian literature, with James Still, Don West, and Jesse Stewart. Don West picked him up and talked to him with a series of did you knows. Did you know that the first Nobel Prize in Literature awarded to a woman was a woman from Appalachia writing her memoirs? Did you know that the first Declaration of Independence was penned in Appalachia? Did you know the first abolitionist newspaper was written in Appalachia? So there are all these did you knows that if people knew more about, it might change their perception of where they come from. It's a retelling of a narrative that we thought we knew so well. And that's one of the reasons that I love this book so much. But the scope of his work is broad, and I encourage you to go look at his website and see all of the wonderful things that he's done and all of the different books he's written. He's written both fiction and nonfiction. He spent the day with us. He was really generous with our students and the time that he took. And what you're going to hear are clips from our conversation in one of my classes. You might hear some background noise. You might hear, classroom noises, shuffling papers and things like that. But that's the context in which this particular episode was recorded. This time last year, I was in New England and I traveled to Sleepy Hollow to Washington Irving's grave. And much of that was prompted by what I had read about Irving in Biggers' book and in the research that I had done about him. But I was intrigued by the fact that he proposed that the United States be renamed the United States of Appalachia because he felt that this great ancient chain of mountains was an appropriate symbol for what the country was meant to be. Enjoy this episode with Jeff Biggers. Want more from the Talkin' Appalachian podcast? Head on over to our Patreon page where you'll get early access to episodes and bonus content, like extended interviews with authors Barbara Kingsolver and Jeanette Walls, my interview with a Southwest Virginia woman who survived a concentration camp before moving to Appalachia, and my 3-part series on the language of Appalachian gravestones. Subscribers will be the first to know about any Talkin' Appalachian merch plus discounts. Subscribe on Patreon and Facebook, and if you're not ready to be a paid subscriber, you can subscribe for free and decide later. You can also find the podcast at Talkin' Appalachian on YouTube.
I actually got picked up hitchhiking near Parisburg, Virginia. I was working on farms. I'd run out of money. This was in the ancient days when we didn't have cell phones or credit cards, so whatever cash you had in your pocket is all you had. And I ended up at a folk school in West Virginia, which was a school talking about Appalachian culture, and it was a farm. So I got up at 5 a.m, milked the cows, and worked on the farm, something I had done in the past with my grandparents. And there's this tall guy, who I just never forget. He had these overalls on. He never wore underwear. And it always kind of creeped me out. And we just get up every morning and do all this kind of labor. And as we were working, be it on putting the fences together or whatever, just your daily jobs on a farm, he would just start talking about Appalachian history, of which I knew nothing about, because I'm not Appalachian. I was born in Ohio, but I'm from Southern Illinois. And then, like many people, when the mines collapsed, my folks packed up the old 60 Chevy and we took off to the west. So when I was 8 years old, I was just dropped in a Mexican neighborhood in Tucson. So I was like this. I went from catfish and cornbread to like green corn tamales and being a vato with, Mexicanos. And this kind of dual identity, and that suddenly began to change, like, well, who am I? Where am I from? And why is it that my parents have a Southern accent when we come from Illinois? Little things like that. Why do they use certain words? Why do my grandparents speak of certain words? Often in the summers, they would take us all the way back down to Southern Illinois. And Southern Illinois is a strange state. I think we think of Illinois as Chicago, right? Kind of talk about the 3 C's of Illinois. You got Chicago, you have Al Capone, and then everybody thinks we have corn. And my family is 360 miles from Chicago. We're 3 miles from Kentucky. And this is coal country. And this is where the upheavals came 300 million years ago. Essentially, the Cumberlands floated down from Kentucky here and then connects us over to Missouri and the Ozarks. And so this strange little area, we actually have 2 mountains, 2 card-carrying mountains that officially made the 1,000 feet area. And so all these dynamics of growing up as a kid, of identity, suddenly began to brew when I find myself over here in West Virginia, in Sumner County, in a little place called Pipestem, West Virginia. Appalachian history, Appalachian culture, what is that? And of course, if you began to think in whatever background you have, there's all these negative stereotypes that we grow up with, and each generation has its own stereotypes, My parents would talk to you about Little Abner, a play that we all had to put on in high school. I don't know if even if you're high school, but when I was growing up, everybody had to do this play called Little Abner that was based on a cartoon character. That was this horrendous cartoon that then was turned into a Broadway musical of a big hillbilly guy and his crazy sister and family and all their adventures they had in the mountains. And it became the defining part of our culture. In each generation, we just had a new Little Abner of what it would be. And of course, Little Abner goes all the way back to Sut Levengood. And this is in the 1850s when we had a cartoon out of New York that was a similar situation. It was about a hillbilly whose brains were unhooked, who would roam through the mountains having adventures. And so each generation would kind of update this, and of course, then we get to Deliverance, and then we eventually get to Wrong Turn and a lot of other good films like that. Wrong Turn Part 3, 4, 5, and 6. And that's all I knew. And so here we are working on this farm in the morning, and this guy saying, did you know that the first Declaration of Independence was in Appalachia? Like, I didn't know that. Well, did you know that the first anti-slavery newspaper was in Appalachia? No, I didn't know that. But did you know that the first African-American newspaper was in Appalachia? That in fact, the first feminist, the first woman to use the word redneck, the first time we saw redneck in print was an Appalachian journalist, a woman. And he just kind of went on with this, did you know? And I didn't really get this part here. And at a certain point, you just kind of stop listening, especially when you're young. I was only 19 years old. But that phrase stayed with me for my whole life. Did you know? Did you know? At a certain point, as I got older, about 25 years afterwards, I asked the question, why don't I know? Why don't I know the first Declaration of Independence was in Appalachia in 1772? So why didn't I know? Did you know who Lee Smith is? She's one of our great exemplars, wouldn't you say, Amy?
Yes.
She may not be from the region. There's media misrepresentation, misperceptions, and for some people it may not matter, some people it does matter. So in 1968, all the Paris clubs, they were obsessed, with jazz. And there you're on this stage, and this beautiful woman comes up on the stage to the piano, and she's severe, this woman. She doesn't smile, and everybody's terrified of her. And she sits down to the piano, and she begins to play a little Bach, and people are thinking, what's going on? We thought she was this great jazz singer. And she said, I studied at the Curtis Institute. She's a classical pianist. And that's what she liked to start with. And then she said, I'm going to sing a little song. It's called Black is the Color of My True Love. She said, this is a little ballad I learned from my little holler in the backwoods of Western North Carolina. And everyone just wondering, wait a minute, we thought we came here in Paris, to hear the most famous jazz singer of all times, this amazing woman. And then finally, Nina Simone, the goddess of soul and jazz, a hillbilly from Western North Carolina, begins to play her jazz, and it changes everybody. And she always began that way, showing that her work was a mix. She said in the beginning of her biography, I'm torn of Cherokee blood, from Africa, from Scots-Irish. And this great amalgam, this great mix, is the sound of Appalachia that brought us jazz. The jazz now that we listen to everywhere. My son studies in Paris at the conservatory as a jazz musician. And he loves talking about how so much of the Paris jazz scene, of course, came from African Americans. And so many of those African Americans brought that mountain roots, that if you want to look at the roots of jazz, you have to talk about Bessie Smith. She was the empress of the blues coming from Chattanooga. They have to talk about W.C. Handy. Now, everybody had titles, he was the Duke and the Doctor and the Baron and the this and the Goddess and that, coming from Northern Alabama. And it just went on that John Coltrane, the greatest saxophone player ever, of course, came from outside Winston-Salem. That Thelonious Monk on the piano, of course, came from Western North Carolina. That Billy Strayhorn's from Mars Hill. That if you just keep going on, so much of jazz, like rhythm and blues, like Bill Withers, quite possibly the most important R&B star for my generation, came from African-American coal miners in West Virginia who brought in that music tradition of Appalachia to Paris. So much of what we know about Paris, of course, has been brought by Appalachia writers. And of course, as we know, Sam Houston from Texas is an Appalachian, and Davy Crockett, coal. Perhaps the greatest natural resource of Appalachia is not its minerals, but it's its people who've actually gone out and changed the way we live in the United States or in the world itself. So why are we biased? Why would we want to say this region has no history that matters? Why would we want to say these people have no culture that matters? That we deny or neglect or erase a history and cultures and histories, we have many histories, because we want to say the people are just basically cannon fodder that we can use in our industries. And of course, it's not just coal. It goes back to the first, lumber industries and the iron ore and then coal and then gas. So there's an erasure of the people in order to get to that. That's a pretty provocative statement, isn't it? Think about that for a second. So here I am in the barrio, in Tucson. And then we eventually moved out of town because it was basically too rough. And it was hard to tell kids what it meant to grow up being called white trash. Because for Mexican kids, it didn't translate. Try to translate that in French or in Italiano or in Espanol. It's like, what? White trash. Didn't translate. And then I had to explain, well, because my people don't matter. We don't have a history. My grandfather, was used up and died from black lung disease. My cousins, my cousins too, but mainly my uncles, broken down with black lung. And then when the coal mine shut, they went up and worked in the steel factories in Indiana and Chicago, and then came down. Broken men in their 50s. We're white trash. We didn't matter. And so here I am milking cows as a 19-year-old in West Virginia. And at one point, this tall guy, his name was Don West, he said, the abuse of the land goes hand in hand with the abuse of the people. that if you can convince people that the people don't matter, then you can take and abuse the land as much as you want. I thought, wow, I never put that together. We're disposable white trash. My grandfather everybody laughed at him, you know? His name was Bob, and everyone called him Old Bob. I think he was called Old Bob. He was this big guy, he was 6'4". My mom always said, he was a man. She said, you look just like your daddy, your granddaddy, except he had muscles. He was a real man. My grandfather was a tough guy, and everybody was terrified of him, a union coal miner, and he was on the front lines, and part of our family is buried with Mother Jones and the Union battles. And we have stories coming out of our ears about the Union battles and fighting for our people. And everybody laughed at my grandpa because when he was 53, he collapsed, both from black lung and from all these other diseases. And he was just a shriveled up old man in his 50s. The abuse of the people goes hand in hand with the abuse of the land. And what I didn't know, milking those cows, working on this farm, listening to Appalachia. I was in 1983, and I would go to Washington, I would go to New York City, I'd go study at Columbia University and finish a city college, and I'd run off to Europe and become a writer, and I'd become a journalist, and then I married an Italian woman. She dragged me back to the United States, and then we run off to Mexico, and I'm writing a book about Mexico and indigenous people and all sorts of narcotraficantes, and I get a letter in 1998 from my uncle in Kentucky who says, it's gone. The 4 plum trees, all of our orchards, all of our hills, the well that we had dropped the bucket, the church that we built, our homestead, which we had founded in 1804, it's all gone. The 10th generation of my family, we were the first Baptist missionaries in Illinois. The 10th generation of my family, we lost our farm to a strip mine. And we were working in the mines. But our holler was the last holler to go. Such thick coal just waiting. Our coal had lit up Chicago in 1893 at the World's Fair. We didn't have electricity until 1952. And my uncle said, you're down saving people in Mexico, saving indigenous people, whatever that is, and you have lost your culture. You don't know who we are. And when I die, when your mother dies, all that history is gone because they didn't pass it on. And that startled me. And I immediately came back from Mexico and I went to the strip pit. And I'll never forget, there I was. And, I was standing with my mom and my uncle. And I was like this. I was going to fall down because I was on a really bad chair. And there's nothing like looking at a strip pit in front of you. And bulldozers are going back and forth. And there's no coal miners like I grew up with. There's just bulldozers and ammonium nitrate fuel oil explosives, 2,000 pounds. And they had come into our holler and took out our cousins one by one, blowing up 2,000 pounds, busted our well. We had fly rock the size of bowling balls came in through our window. In the 10th generation, my cousin had to sell the farm. She had just lost her husband in a coal mining accident underground. And I'm looking at this hole thinking, what did I lose? I didn't know. Why didn't I know this? And why did it take a crisis to lose everything, to realize I have a history, I have a culture, and now it's my turn to go find out what it's about. But I was too late when I had been warned in Appalachia. And that was the beginning of my story. And I realized before I wrote this book, I had to write a book to Appalachia first, to thank what I learned here and to tell you the stories I'd learned in 1983. Re-Storification. So I spend half of my year in Italy. One thing I've learned is you should always marry people from beautiful countries because you get really nice, long, extended vacations out of that. Re-Storification. So in Italy, I live in 2 places. One is called Bologna, and the other one is Sardinia. So here's Italy. It's the boot, but let's just pretend that's Italy. And here's Sicily, which we always hear about. It's Sicily and all the problems of Sicily. And we don't realize that Sicily is really one of the great fountains of culture in all Western civilization. And then above Sicily is another island called Sardinia. Sardinia is considered a wasteland. It has the most beautiful beaches in the world. If you saw Little Mermaid, it was filmed there. Everybody goes, all the movie stars and jet set go to Sardinia when you see them every summer on their boats. But everybody's afraid to go into the rest of the island. It's scary. There's violent people, there's outlaws, there's extraction industries. They don't have any history. And I kept thinking, I think I've heard this story before. And I began to wonder about Sardinia. And then I began to travel. And the center zone, which is all mountains, Sardinia is 80% mountain. And the main county, let's say it's called a province, provincia, it's called the Barbagia. And that word comes from the ancient Romans who referred to barbarians. And barbarians comes from the Greek, meaning Babel, that they don't speak our language, they're barbarians. And so this province today is still called Barbagia, the barbarians. And they were known as these kind of wild mountain people who were violent, who had no culture, who you had to be careful of. There were family feuds that were famous in Sardinia. And I kept thinking, God, I think I've heard that before. And so I began to do research on Sardinia, and I realized, wow, the first woman to win the Nobel laureate for literature was from Sardinia. Her name was Deleda, Grazia Deleda. I thought that, that's crazy because, in the United States, who was the first woman to win the Nobel laureate for literature? It was a hillbilly. Her name was Pearl Buck, who actually studied in Virginia. But she was from West Virginia. When she gets to Stockholm to get her Nobel Prize, they say, yes, you've written all these great novels about China, but we're giving you this award for your great memoir about growing up in West Virginia. And in the Barbagia, you suddenly had an incredible array of people who had changed Italy. The greatest politicians came from Sardinia. The greatest union activists came from Sardinia. The people who had changed the art world had come from Sardinia. The intelligentsia had come from Sardinia. And it was one after another. I'm thinking, wait a minute, this is exactly the same story I told in Appalachia. And so much of Appalachia is not what happened here, but how Appalachians had gone out and changed the world as we knew it. And in Barbagia, we began a project called Re-Storification. We said, if you want to restore the land, you first need to re-story it. Because Barbagia had been completely deforested and destroyed. And there had been mass out-migration. Very similar to our communities in Appalachia. In order to restore that land, though, we couldn't simply replant the trees. We needed to re-story it. Give it a new story. To tell the old stories that either had been affected by media misrepresentation. Everybody from Sardinia is an outlaw. People didn't think they mattered. They had lost their family dissemination. They had lost their language. Sardinians have their own language. And that they had been dominated by an extraction. And the history had been written by people who weren't from there. The most important book about Sardinia was written by a guy named D.H. Lawrence. You might have to read in high school. D.H. Lawrence was a very famous novelist from England who actually came from a coal mining background, funny enough. And he wrote a book in 1921 called Sea in Sardinia. That is the most important book in 1921. And he said, in Sardinia, there is no history. There's no race, there's no culture. They've offered nothing to the world. In 1921, Grazia Deleda wrote 5 novels and soon would win the Nobel Prize. A Sardinian won the Biennale, which is the most important art show of Venice. In 1921, a man named Antonio Gramsci would change us and how we think of political theory. And eventually he would die under the fascist regime. In 1921, a man named Emilio Lussu was a war hero who would go on to write the Italian Constitution. In 1921, the coal miners of Sardinia actually had the first general strike in all of Italy. 1921 was an incredible year for Sardinia. But from the outsider perspective, they were just a bunch of outlaws who had no history. And that is what we had to restore. We had to begin to re-story the region. By having young people like you begin to ask their parents, ask their grandparents, go into their communities and start to do the hard work of research. For example, in Sardinia, there was a centuries-old tradition, actually millennia, of doing poetry slams. That whole community would come together and 2 people would have a debate in poetry over a certain theme. And they actually went all the way back to 4,000 years. And we realized Sardinia, in fact, was the cradle of the Bronze Age. This is 4,000 years ago. If you go through Sardinia, there's these huge stone towers that look like medieval castles, but they're not medieval. They're 4,000 years old. They had this thriving culture, and we know it because it's been documented in a lot of their artisan work. So how do we restore and have a re-storification of Appalachia today? That's the big question now. And do we need it? Do we need it? You know, re-storification is the process of continually creating new stories, new gathering, new rituals, which give meaning to the history today. The key word in re-storification is continuum, that your history is here. History meaning your story from the past. And it's always histories. And what's that continuum that connects us to the future? And how do we retell that story to make it relevant and it weaves into our story of the future? And that's exactly why I wrote United States of Appalachia. It was not an index of, here's the 50 famous people that came from Appalachia. It was to say, Appalachians were on the forefront of democracy. Appalachians were on the forefront of abolition and equality. Appalachians were in the forefront of economic justice. Appalachians were in the forefront of freedom of the press. Appalachians were in the forefront of our arts, the narrative arts, be it music, literature, and other art. That these were just the beginning of themes that still matter today. I think they still matter today. Just think in your own personal life, is there anything that you'd want to restore in your family that you first would need to tell the story? I'll give you a little example. My mom, who just passed on recently, she was 91, and we don't have many heirlooms left because when my dad was 80, he had cancer, and he went and got treatment, and he miraculously survived. So my parents ran off to do their dream house in the mountains of Arizona, lived in this beautiful area called Sedona, and the third day they were there, their house burned down. And so we lost everything, and all the quilts from grandma, and all those silly little things that amount to nothing. We had one cousin run off, become a famous painter, and we lost all his paintings. And my mom said, it's not the stuff, it's not this, it was the story of this, that your aunt gave me that plate for Christmas in 1946. And I remember that moment. And that was the story she needed to restore. My mom was just a tough coal miner's daughter. She grew up in a house with no plumbing, electricity, or water. And she was just so tough, even to the very end when she was struggling. And she said, we lost things in the fire, big deal. I still have the stories. I can restore it. And so for me, coming from a union mining family, rednecks were the miners who marched, at the Battle of Blair's Mountain. And to distinguish themselves, they had a scarf around their neck. So we reclaimed that term redneck as something that was good. And then I wrote a book about the first journalist, Anne Royal, who went on trial as a witch in the 1820s. And she actually was the first person to put the word redneck into press, believe it or not, in the 1830s. And a redneck for her, of course, referred to the Presbyterians who had come into the Carolinas, and that referred to a bloody history. So it's called Trials of a Scold. And so you're saying even to restore, we have to be careful about what words we use. So much of our guitar playing, of course, was because African Americans brought it up the mountains. But that guitar was brought over by French immigrants. Just like the mandolin brought over by Italian and Spanish immigrants. Just like the banjo, of course, made the Middle Passage all the way from Africa and came in through communities and were brought up by African Americans. So much of that incredible mix of who we are, that the dulcimer, the mountain dulcimer, which to me is the ultimate Appalachian instrument, I love the dulcimer, is German. It's a zither that was brought in by German immigrants that were incredibly mixed. The big bang of country music is because hillbillies were playing black minstrel songs. And the black and white have always been together in our music. The Carter family, who are kings here, kings and queens, that we worship because of, we all grew up on the Carter music, and Stanley, of course. The Carter family traveled with a guy named Leslie Riddle, one of the greatest guitar players from Burnsville, North Carolina. Because the problem about Carter is he couldn't write music. He could hear it, he could play it, he was a genius, But Leslie Riddle would hear a song, they go door to door, and he'd write it down. And Leslie was an African-American guitar player who helped make the Carter family. This is part of that Re-Storification. Melungeons were an ethnically mixed people. Similar in Maryland, we called it the we sort people, we sorta a people. The Melungeons were similar, who played a vital role in many different communities, especially in Tennessee and Virginia. But think about that farm, the roots, what they did beyond just dairy farm. And why do we have sorghum in Appalachia, and how that and where it came from, and how it became a uniquely Appalachian thing.
I'm starting a new segment on the podcast called Voice Place. And that's not my word, that's Georgella Lyon's word. It is a word that means the people and places who shaped your first voice. I'm doing this because I get so many stories from people who want to share about maybe a time when they were bullied because of their dialect or someone made fun of it, or maybe an awakening they had and they became proud of their speech. Or maybe it's a word or a series of words that they always heard their family saying and they did some research and found out what they meant. I just hear all kinds of stories and I thought maybe this would be a good way to fold these stories into the podcast. So I have a new email address. It's called talkingappalachianpodcast@gmail.com. And that's where you can send me your audio clips, 30 seconds or less, or your written stories about your voice place. To me, that's with the understanding that they might appear on the podcast. So I'm looking forward to hearing about your voice place.